Captain Midnight.
This video is brought to you by Adam and Eve. Use the link in the description and code MIDNIGHT to get 50% off one item and free shipping in the US and Canada. So 42 years after the series began, a new Evil Dead film opened in theaters this month, bringing yet another entry into one of the oddest and most unique horror franchises in movie history. Where a lot of horror franchises in the past, from Evil Dead's contemporaries like Halloween and Nightmare on Elm Street, to more relatively recent franchises like Saw and Paranormal Activity, almost immediately turned to pumping out new installments very quickly, Evil Dead has kind of stood apart, being spared the relentless schedule, mostly because the early films were more cult favorites than mainstream hits. The result, at least to me, is that this has made the franchise a little more interesting to talk about than many of the others. I want to go over all of them, from its scrappy beginnings to present day, where it's kind of split into two separate franchises under the same umbrella. But I haven't really covered a lot of horror films before, so if you like Evil Dead and want to see more videos on the genre, it'd really help if you could share this video, and of course hit subscribe along with that almighty bell. But with all that out of the way, let's get into it.
When the world needed a hero,
this one was so about to die.
what it got was him.
Groovy.
Thanks to Bruce Campbell's memoir, If Chins Could Kill, there are very few movies out there with a more entertaining production to read about than The Evil Dead. I think it's a story that really resonates with anyone with creative aspirations who also grew up pretty far away from entertainment hubs like LA, London, or New York. Sam Raimi met Bruce Campbell at their Michigan school when they were teens, bonding over their shared love of comic books, horror movies, and of course the Three Stooges, whose old theatrical shorts were still in constant TV syndication in the 70s. Also, Sam Raimi apparently really loved to show up to school dressed as Sherlock Holmes. That doesn't actually have anything to do with The Evil Dead, I just wanted to include it. Soon they started shooting horror and comedy short films with titles like Corny Casanovas and Booby Bartenders. Eventually, those shorts were shown at local drive-ins, and they were able to raise enough money for Within the Woods, kind of a short film version of Evil Dead. And using that as proof of concept, they were able to find investors for the full-length version from family, friends, and others, especially dentists who had a lot of cash to burn. And apparently those investors continue to get checks from the film's royalties to this day. Of course, none of that would have amounted to much if the movie itself didn't make an impact. And while no one would ever mistake the first Evil Dead for an acting tour de force, it definitely managed that. It's undeniably rough around the edges. Shot in rural Tennessee, its grueling production is really obvious on screen, with the sweat and grime from the southern heat adding to the ragged texture of the film and giving it kind of a specific production value that you don't really see in more high-budget studio horror. The star of this show in this first movie, more than anything else, is Sam Raimi's direction. With all due respect to my deranged buddy Jason Voorhees, I think the difference between Evil Dead and that first Friday the 13th is really striking. The latter was made very cynically by people trying to capitalize on the success of John Carpenter's Halloween, where the love and enthusiasm that was poured into The Evil Dead just gives it so much more verve and energy. On a bigger budget than he'd ever had in his very young career, Sam Raimi brings this abrasive, forceful style to set piece after set piece, taking cues from Night of the Living Dead, EC horror comics, and of course, vaudevillian slapstick comedy. He manages to construct a stripped-down, mean little horror story that just feels like more than the sum of its parts. It's disgusting and a little disturbing. When I first watched the movie, I was like 15 and I was still diving into the horror genre for the first time. I remember asking my friend to turn it off at one point. If you've seen the movie, you probably know the scene. I'm glad we didn't though, because by the end, I was fully on board. It helps that the movie is pretty funny too, though oftentimes unintentionally due to the pretty uneven acting. But while I can praise Raimi's work all day, I do have to address the elephant in the room here. That his childhood friend just so happened to be one of the most charismatic actors, ever. Over the course of The Evil Dead, we get to see him go from a terrified coward to something of a hero. And with much of the film shot in chronological order, it's really great to watch him gain more and more confidence as an actor, giving us a hint of the performer that he'd later become. Ashley Williams as a character is of course not fully formed yet, and though the movies and later Ash TV show have never exactly placed strict continuity at the forefront of the franchise, I do think that in those first 3 you can find a really strong character journey. In the first film, Ash seems like the type of character who is destined to die early, but over the course of the movie, his driving characteristic, and really the single trait that I think most defines him, comes into focus. His complete and total stubbornness. Even when all hell has been unleashed, even when it feels like things are so unbelievably horrific that life could never be the same again and maybe isn't worth living, he just keeps going. And one thing I think we all love so much about Ash is this doesn't make him a better person. He isn't a scared but wise and caring survivor like Laurie Strode in the newer Halloween movies. Defying hell and death over and over again just makes him a really arrogant asshole and allows Bruce Campbell to chew scenery like no other. Of course, the balance between horror and comedy hits its peak in Evil Dead 2, which is at once a quasi-remake of the first film and so much more than that. I have watched this movie over and over again. It's got it all. It's slapstick, camp, cosmic horror, and of course, Campbell one-liners. The budget is bigger here, but it still has that really ramshackle, let's just put on a show energy that gave the first one its spark. The movie feels like complete chaos, while also having total control over this very specific horror comedy tone that so many movies have aimed for since, and very few have managed to replicate. The next film, Army of Darkness, leans far, far more into the humor. For many fans at the time, I think a little too far. But the movie's reputation has only grown over time, and for good reason, I think. Like, this is a deeply, deeply silly movie. Really, when you take a step back, it's bizarre that this and Evil Dead 2013 are loosely in the same series of films. Army of Darkness is just this unapologetic combination of slapstick comedy and the classic effects of Ray Harryhausen. Don't get me wrong, the Three Stooges influence is all over Evil Dead 2, but Raimi is pushing that even harder here, with the memorable Ash versus many Ash sequences getting about as far from being an actual horror film as these movies would ever get. That really threw me off the first time I watched it, but now, especially after subsequent films have taken the series back to such a darker place, I can really appreciate this one for what it is. A bizarre and funny cult comedy that has a shockingly great siege sequence at the end. It also really crystallized who Ash was as a character in pretty much any media going forward, and gave us a good portion of Bruce Campbell's most iconic line readings.
Well, hello, Mr. Fancy Pants. I got news for you, pal. You ain't leading but 2 things right now. Jack and shit. And Jack left town.
It's after these initial 3 that the franchise gets very strange, and not in a negative way exactly, but like I said, it almost splits itself in 2. Now we have a pair of films that are trying to be really gruesome horror movies, and an Ash TV series that's far more comedic and usually striving to hit that Evil Dead 2 balance. Though with Ash's more over-the-top comedic persona from Army of Darkness, a movie that the show can actually never reference due to rights issues. I guess I'll address the films first. The Evil Dead 2013 is yet another quasi-remake of the first movie, but leaning as far away from the campy humor as these movies have ever gotten. And I think it's pretty good, at times even great. Director Fede Alvarez isn't trying to ape Raimi and brings his own slightly more slow burn sensibilities to the project. And though I think at times it can get a little sluggish and self-serious compared to what I want from Evil Dead, the body horror is genuinely effective. I'm not going to show a bunch of it here, but man, that tongue scene, it really sticks with you. What sells me on the movie most is the climax though, as the rain of blood provides that extra little surrealist touch that I just really crave from these films. Now, I'm not sure this more serious vein of Evil Dead is always what I want from the franchise, but the 2013 version does manage to stand out from the field of awful horror remakes that were just everywhere in the late 2000s and early 2010s. It feels like a movie that someone really wanted to make, as opposed to like the soullessness of the most recent Nightmare on Elm Street. The new Evil Dead Rise, this one I'm a little less into. As far as body horror goes, it's pretty effective. Though some of the CGI is spotty, the practical work, or at least what they managed to pull off by blending practical and CGI together, is really disgusting and impressive. I'll try to be vague about spoilers here, but the creature that the Deadites create near the end is just truly creepy stuff, while also being just a little goofy too, which is really that Evil Dead 2 balance. Much like the 2013 film, I think the movie shines brightest in that final act, but overall, I'm not sure that Rise is really as comfortable with its own tone as previous films. The remake had the lead character's addiction storyline at its center, but aside from that, its characters were fairly thinly sketched, like Ash's friends from the first two movies. Rise fills up a lot of its running time with more grounded kitchen sink drama. The sister's pregnancy, the breaking apart of this family that's teetering on the edge of poverty and who are being kicked out of their apartment. It's just a much more traditional movie setup, so when it gets to the gory excess that the series is known for, it just feels like it might belong in a slightly different movie. Things like an eyeball popping out and flying into a character's mouth not only feel very been there done that, especially by Evil Dead standards, it also just feels like an attempt to be more like the franchise, rather than something that comes organically from the tone of the story that they're trying to tell here. I don't think it's a bad movie, and Alyssa Sutherland is great as the mom, giving us one of the most memorable Deadite demons in series history, but it does feel like a director that's trying to fit his very dour screenplay into the wacky Evil Dead mold. And it winds up in this middle ground where it's a lot less fun than the Campbell entries, and a little less scary and suspenseful than the 2013 entry. I like the EC Comics-like melodrama of Evil Dead 2, of Ash screaming into the night sky in anguish like he's in an old Universal monster movie. That's where a lot of the charm comes from. This more naturalistic approach to the drama just makes it feel a lot more in line with most other dark horror films. So, not a bad movie, but also not one I really see myself revisiting.
Hey, isn't that supposed to be a chainsaw?
You want a piece of this? Yeah, I didn't.
Rated M for mature.
Come on, you freak!
Then there's the Bruce Campbell side of the equation, with the 3-season Starz show Ash vs. the Evil Dead. And as much as I like the 2013 film, and can respect what Rise was striving for, this show kinda solidifies to me how much of what I love about Evil Dead comes down to this one performance. Though it apparently had a troubled production behind the scenes and didn't last as long as it should have, this show wound up being far better than I expected, with Campbell not really losing a step as Ash, and a really strong supporting cast being placed around him. It gets to play with all the shades of the franchise too, being both a really goofy comedy and having a sense of horror stakes and atmosphere. If you haven't checked this one out yet and you have any affection for Evil Dead at all, I do highly recommend it. Raimi directed the pilot, and I think it's worth it for that alone, just getting to see him work on a relatively low budget again after the bloated mess that was that Oz movie. It also gives the Deadites their playful sense of humor back. The two most recent movies have the demons being just as cruel and twisted as ever, but I also feel like they lose a little of what made the Evil Dead Deadites unique. That goofy, taunting quality, that sense of humor that the Deadites share with Sam Raimi, where they just want to see what kind of horrible, wacky stuff they can force Bruce Campbell to do. So when all is said and done, while I'm glad that the more recent films exist, especially the 2013 one, they'll always feel a little like overly serious tribute bands to me. After the Starz show ended, Campbell announced that he would never play Ash again, which made sense. I mean, the man is almost 65, and this is a role where he's constantly smashing plates against his head and having fake blood shot at his face. But lately, especially after doing the new video game, he's kind of been walking that back, saying he would return to the role if Raimi directed. And it's also looking like an animated series could be on the horizon, which I'm sure Campbell would prefer. I do genuinely hope it happens, because the show proved that he can still really bring his A-game to Ash. But even where Evil Dead stands now, with its kind of strange split franchise, one with Ash, the other with new characters, they're all still hitting a level of quality that's almost unbelievable after 4+ decades. Lots of horror franchises outstay their welcome, but Evil Dead still manages to feel vital, funny when it wants to be, and still pretty disturbing when it wants to go in that direction as well. In some strange way, what started as an ultra-low budget short film from Michigan has proved as unkillable as the Deadites themselves.
Here's a special tip for the fellas and girls who have not already joined Captain Midnight's new 1940 Flight Patrol. You'd better hurry up and join at once, because there's a big adventure ahead. The thing to do now is to get started, because we're going to have not only barrels of fun, but loads of free gifts and prizes, too.